again, this is the webinar for Good Measure, Practical Tips for Measuring the Impact of Financial Inclusion on Women's Economic Empowerment. As part of the Data and Measurement Working Group under the Community Practice, CGAP is hosting this webinar in collaboration with IPA and JPAL to highlight JPAL's new research guide and to explore opportunities for applying this tool within the women's financial inclusion space. As we know, women's economic empowerment has reemerged as a top priority for policymakers as a development objective in its own right, as well as an expected outcome across a range of sectoral interventions. And donors supporting financial inclusion initiatives are increasingly interested in understanding not just whether women have access to and are using finance, but also whether they are benefiting from finance in the form of tangible improvements in their lives. As a result, M&E practitioners and researchers are grappling with how to define such a complex concept as women and girls empowerment and incorporate them into impact evaluations and measurement frameworks guiding our work. The key objectives for this webinar today are to highlight emerging good practices and considerations for measuring women's economic empowerment across a range of development sectors, to identify indicators that have been used and have relevance for future application within financial inclusion programming, and to discuss some strategies for ensuring measurement frameworks developed are useful and relevant for the local context. We are pleased today to have with us Claire Walsh and Lucia Diaz-Martin from JPAL at MIT, representing their work on JPAL's gender sector, as well as Nellie Moore from IPA's Financial Inclusion Program, who's also working on gender as a priority thematic area. So without further ado, I will hand it over to JPAL to provide an overview of their toolkit, and we'll pass it over to you.
Thanks so much, Dina. Thanks, Yasmin, and thanks to the entire community of practice for hosting this webinar. My name is Claire Walsh, and I'm here with my colleague Lucia Diaz-Martin, who leads JPAL's gender sector. Today, we want to give a brief introduction to our guide to measuring women's empowerment that we co-authored with Rachel Glenister. Sorry, just trying to bring up the slides. Great. And while the guide was designed for researchers and practitioners working across sectors, like Dina said, today we're going to focus on how it can be applied in women's economic empowerment and financial inclusion. It's first important to define what we mean by empowerment. In our guide, we draw on the seminal definitions of empowerment by Naila Kabir and agency by Amartya Sen. And these definitions really shape the measurement approach we recommend in the guide, which is to take seriously the notion that empowerment is about people gaining the ability to make choices that are important to them, that they want, which is likely different in different contexts or different from what we may want. Narrowing the scope to women's economic empowerment, I really like this definition by Sonia Laszlo, Kate Grantham, and others that draws on Kabir's resources, agency, and achievements framework. And what comes through clearly in this definition is that just providing resources or access to resources is just the first step. When we think about measuring empowerment, we need to think about measuring things beyond just access and use of resources, because when we provide them, it's not guaranteed that they will lead to increased agency, or whether with increased agency, we will find meaningful improvements in women's lives or economic status. So because empowerment is a process, it's important to go beyond measuring just access to resources. But when we try to go beyond just measuring access to resources, we encounter many challenges. I've listed just a few of the challenges in measuring empowerment here. So if empowerment is about people gaining the ability to make choices they want to make, this is quite hard to do because we rarely observe decision-making directly. We are often left with asking people about how they made decisions in the past. What's the best way to do that? Are there other ways to measure agency besides asking people about past decisions? Another key challenge is narrowing down the long list of potential indicators we think might be related to the services or products we're offering, and narrowing it down to the 4 to 5 key indicators that really matter. Another important question that comes up a lot is whether we should use standardized measurement tools or try to create our own custom ones, or a combination of both. Additionally, we may wonder whether we actually need to go out and collect new data at all, or whether we can use existing administrative data sources. And when we do collect data, how can we do it in a way that's affordable and respectful? So these are just some of the challenges that we discuss and provide tips on how to overcome in our guide. And what's different about our guide is that we don't provide a suite of ready-to-go survey instruments. Instead, we outline a process of developing a measurement strategy that is appropriate to your context and your purpose. And so you don't have to start from scratch when you're doing this. We also provide a long appendix of survey modules and non-survey instruments used by JPAL-affiliated professors in their impact evaluations that you can pilot and adapt to your context and needs. Now, the measurement approach we outline in the guide is very detailed and intensive, but it can be scaled to fit different purposes. So it's first important to determine what we want to use the data and results we collect for, what decisions do we want to make with them. And by doing this, we can scale our measurement approach to different uses. So for instance, if we're developing and collecting data on 2 new key performance indicators across products in a variety of different contexts, we perhaps don't need to develop a detailed questionnaire. We can focus on identifying the 2 most relevant survey questions that we can collect from clients during the regular course of business. On the other hand, if we're designing a product or service and we want to try to design it so that it can increase women's control over the income she earns, we may not need to do a survey at all, but instead conduct semi-structured interviews, focus groups, and user tests with clients. So what is this process for developing a strategy for measuring women's empowerment? We think there are 4 key phases. The first phase is formative research to understand gender dynamics and empowerment better in a specific context. And this ideally starts to take place even before you design a product, service, or your M&E tool. The second phase is to use what you learn from the formative research to write down a clear theory of change and select appropriate outcomes and indicators. And then the third phase is turning these indicators into survey questions or non-survey instruments and piloting them with real people to make sure that people understand them and that they generate the info we want. We can also identify existing data sources that can be used to track certain outcomes. And the fourth phase we need to think about is how we're going to collect the data. Who are we going to interview? What survey technology are we going to use? When are we going to try to talk to them? Who is doing the interviewing, etc. And if you take anything away from our webinar today, these are the 5 key tips that we hope you remember. First is that good measurement really depends on understanding gender dynamics and what women want but can't currently do in a particular context. So for this reason, it's really important not to skip over formative research. This can help inform your measurement process throughout every stage. The second tip is to make use of existing administrative data and data collection processes to lower data collection costs. The third tip is to think about drawing on standardized measures, but making sure they really fit empowerment and what women want in your particular context by adapting them to your context. Fourth, we think it's critical to pilot all data collection instruments with real people before starting data collection or deciding that this will be the M&E tool we use across the organization. And the fifth tip is just to remember that gender dynamics are also present in the way we collect data. So first, formative research. What is it? So formative research is conducted generally prior to designing a product or designing M&E activities to better understand the nature and extent and root causes of a problem or an opportunity, and to generate ideas about potential solutions. And when we're thinking about economic empowerment, our goal might be to answer 3 key questions. What do women want that they currently can't do? What is constraining them or limiting their agency? And third, what are some possible ways to relieve these constraints? And we generate data on these questions through a combination of field and desk research. So in addition to reading existing research from a number of different disciplines, from sociology, anthropology, history, research by service providers or other financial institutions, economics research, we also want to create repeated opportunities to listen to women and other stakeholders to learn more about their lives, aspirations, and constraints as they relate to the work that we do. And we do this by conducting semi-structured interviews, focus groups, direct observation, primarily through qualitative methods. Now, I want to say that none of this is new or revolutionary. We think that this is the type of formative research that should take place before any impact evaluation. So here's an example of all that formative research can help us do, and I want to illustrate this through an evaluation by Erica Fields, Rachel Glenister, Shahana Nazmeen, and co-authors that took place in rural southwest Bangladesh. This was a randomized control trial that had a heavy qualitative component where they had a cultural anthropologist on their research team who conducted qualitative interviews before and throughout the evaluation. And the evaluation was testing whether an empowerment program or a non-cash conditional transfer or a combination of both could reduce child marriage and increase young women's empowerment, including their economic empowerment after these young women got married. And these are just some of the things that they learned in their formative research. So as you'll notice in the first row, many people consider labor force participation a sign of empowerment, but researchers found the reality was more complex. Even though a woman is working, her choices related to work may still be highly constrained. In their qualitative interviews, they found that many married women who were working out of necessity following economic shocks, like a family member getting sick. And for those who were working, their choice of work was highly constrained to small businesses that they could run without leaving their house, such as tutoring or tailoring. The researchers also learned some interesting things about the ways women negotiated the ability to start a business in their home with their husbands and in-laws. And they found that often women were giving up autonomy or agency in some areas to get agency in others, namely being able to start their own business. Researchers also learned quite a lot of important details about how to word survey questions correctly in this context, such as how to ask about dowry when dowry is illegal and widely known to be illegal. So for all these reasons and many others, we think formative research is really important to good measurement. Moving on to theory of change. Writing down a theory of change helps you narrow down the rich information you find in formative research to focus on the 45 key things that you actually measure. So there are many different components that can be measured in order to help understand how financial inclusion is contributing to women's economic empowerment or not. On this slide, I've listed some of the main buckets that researchers and practitioners think are plausibly related to financial products and services. And so when we think about moving beyond just access to resources and use of resources, we think about how women's financial lives are changing. Do they have more ability to make decisions within the household or their businesses? Do they set financial goals and achieve them? Do they have an improved quality of life? How do we narrow this big, long list down to the 4 to 5 key things we want to measure? With all of these possibilities, it's important that we are strategic in what we ultimately choose to measure. I would say that for the purposes of monitoring, it's often good to think about measuring a max of 2 indicators per outcome. These are 4 questions you can ask yourself to help narrow down the list of many indicators to the few. And the first is to ask yourself, what's the goal of the product or service and what can it plausibly change? The outcomes we measure should be plausibly related to the financial product or service. For instance, credit products may work in different ways than savings products, and we have to think through, does it really give women more income and assets or more control over these income and assets? The second question we can ask ourselves is, do these outcomes matter to the women we interviewed in our formative research? Are these the things they said they wanted to do but can't currently do? And then we have to think practically about time frame and what we can collect with our limited budget. So before I hand it over to Lucia, I just want to give one nice example of how researchers used a theory of change to narrow down the list of indicators they measure related to empowerment to 4 to 5, and how they used formative research to shape what they measured. This is a log frame depicting a theory of change from an evaluation by Nava Ashraf, Dean Carlin, and Wesley Yin, conducted in partnership with the Green Bank in the Philippines. And the Green Bank was offering a commitment savings account called SEED, which provided individuals with a commitment to restrict access to their savings until they reached a goal date or a goal savings amount, thus potentially helping with either self-control or family control issues. And if you look at the indicator column, the third column here, you'll notice several things. They only measured 4 to 5 indicators, 1 to 2 indicators at each step of the theory of change. Their inputs and output measures in the first 2 rows could be measured without collecting new data at all, using just administrative data that the bank already has. And when we look at the outcomes related to agency and achievements that they chose to measure, they picked those that could plausibly change as a result of this type of account. And when they measured decision-making and whether households bought more durable goods that women said they cared about and they wanted to buy but couldn't currently buy, they got this list of decisions and the list of the goods women care about from focus groups that they had conducted with women and local researchers during their formative research. So now I want to hand it over to Lucia.
Great, thanks so much, Claire. So the next step, once we've selected the outcomes that we want to prioritize in our research, is to develop and validate the data collection instruments that can help us measure those outcomes. So luckily, there are many survey questions and modules that have been developed by other organizations and are commonly used by researchers. Some examples are listed here on the screen. Some of you have likely used these in the past. One I'd like to call out specifically is the Emerge website, which focuses on compiling metrics related to women's empowerment and gender equality. So one way of using some of these pre-existing indicators and metrics then is to kind of integrate it into our existing data collection processes and our existing touch points with clients. So that could be just in our day-to-day operations, but we could also consider building out some additional data collection processes like using SMS, perhaps live phone call surveys, or interactive voice response calls, and Acumen Fund's Lean Data Field Guide provides some insights on how to set up that kind of process. But ultimately, another option could be to really maximize our administrative data and the data collection processes that are already underway and all the numbers that we already have at our disposal. So for example, if we're a lending operation and we regularly are collecting cash flow analyses and balance sheet statements from clients, we could potentially digitize a representative sample of those to track improvements in women's financial positions over time. So many of us might also look at the different take-up of different products by gender. And one thing to note here is that there is some research that, including the study that Claire just mentioned in the Philippines, indicating that in contexts in which women have low levels of bargaining power in the household, there have been some studies that found that they may have preferences for accounts with less liquidity in order to better maintain control over funds and really protect those resources from competing demands within the household. So if you're noting similar trends in your own analysis of product take-up and usage, it might be useful to confirm whether or not the dynamics within the household play a big factor and really think about additional product design features that could be useful for this client segment. So if we have decided then to build in some new metrics and select some new data points to measure, one element we want to carefully consider is whether or not we'd want to use internationally standardized versus locally tailored metrics. So of course, a key benefit from using pre-existing metrics is that many have been designed and tested by researchers. Another plus is the fact that it can be instructive to compare outcomes across interventions and across contexts. So, how does this intervention fare in the Philippines compared to in Peru? The key concern, however, is that standardized metrics may not actually be picking up some of the local variation and the changes that that women are actually experiencing from place to place, and that these kinds of nuances that would be most informative for our analysis. Yet with instruments that are highly locally tailored, we lose the ability to compare across interventions, across contexts. However, these metrics might be more likely to capture subtler changes in the lives of our clients. So our recommendation then is to use a combination of standardized and tailored metrics. The key, however, is to always pilot test our data collection instrument in the field to ensure that our questions are well understood. So let's jump into an example that illustrates this point. So this is a common set of questions regarding decision-making for household purchases based off of a similar series of questions in the Demographic and Health Survey Women's Status module, essentially asking who makes a decision, the husband, the wife, or both jointly. The underlying question here, though, is how do people interpret and internalize the concept of joint decision-making? What do they mean when they say that we both made this decision together? So the dialogue on the screen is a conversation between a woman in the highlands of Peru and an interviewer, really highlighting the fact that this woman is interpreting a decision-making process as joint because it involves some dialogue. However, it appears that in the case of purchasing the cow, the husband was the primary decision maker, at least under the way that the question about decision making is the way that it's intended to gather information. So In this and in many other cases, it may seem obvious what different response options imply and what it means to make a decision with a person versus individually, but until we actually go and talk to people, we may not be sure exactly how they're understanding the question or the response options. Another illustration of how to take a more general question and ensure it's understood and actually capturing what we want to measure is from a research initiative by health-related researchers in Bangladesh. The study that Claire cited earlier with our co-author Rachel Glenister and other researchers. And so this illustrates how the research team took the general DHS question about decision-making and piloted it to tailor it really to the local context. So the key here, the key difference between the first question and the three questions that followed are that they're really talking about a specific decision point rather than this general question of making decision about healthcare, which, if you think about your own life, could be challenging to actually answer without having a specific scenario in mind. So in this case, they took the concrete scenario if a child is sick and the husband is not home or needing medicine for oneself. So these were really decisions of real consequence that someone might face in their day-to-day life. And these examples were also based on extensive formative research about the constraints in this particular context in Bangladesh, namely women's restricted mobility. And interestingly, the researchers did find different results when asking the more standardized DHS question versus the more tailored version of the question, really calling to mind what exactly the first question was measuring compared to the series of three questions. Another aspect to interrogate when it comes to decision-making questions is really how we interpret empowerment related to the various options. So in contexts where women's choices and mobility are highly limited, we might think that being able to make decisions by herself is a sign of empowerment. But in contexts in which women are overburdened with huge amounts of domestic tasks, adding merely another thing to the list of chores to do and decisions to make with no support might actually be a sign of disempowerment. So we understand that it's challenging to incorporate outcome-level data in our data collection strategies. So one low-cost informative option could be to add in a question on subjective matters. What a person wants in their own life and their sense of self are key aspects of empowerment. And many of our theories of change related to women's economic empowerment involve improving women's perceived quality of life, happiness, decreasing stress, increasing a sense of possibility, self-esteem, and agency. So we could add in a few questions to our regular touch points with clients to capture these subjective elements. And these are a few examples on the screen that are interesting, and of course there's many others out there. And there might be other ways in which adding one or a few questions can be useful to gauge how clients' lives are improving. So if things like mobility or reduction in the acceptance of domestic violence are key parts of our theory of change, there's some well-established survey questions that we could add into our data collection process to track changes in these outcomes over time. Now, of course, I'll acknowledge these are sensitive questions, and it may be preferable to find private, non-intrusive ways of collecting this information, so maybe not at the communal bank meeting or at the bank teller line, but finding alternative opportunities. So we might also want to track ideas about gender norms. And one way to do this is by using vignettes. So hypothetical scenarios where characters are facing certain decisions. And so it's a way of asking about someone's beliefs without having them have to state them firmly or make concrete statements about their own life. And so using vignettes can help mitigate the risk of social desirability bias, which is when people say what they think researchers want to hear rather than what they actually believe. And so this vignette, for example, could help capture ideas about gender roles when it comes to decision-making on or financial decisions within the household. But vignettes have also been used to measure bargaining power, so especially within the household. So this vignette asks a woman whether or not she'd rather share a certain amount of money with a partner or maintain a smaller amount to herself. And researchers have found that preferring much smaller amounts to keep to herself compared to larger amounts for joint ownership is indicative of having less control over resources in the home, because it implies that the larger amount is less preferable than the smaller amount in which she could kind of maintain more of a say. So it's also possible to use self-reported data for financial outcomes. So here's a question from the GINS Navigating Impact website, which seems just like a good way about asking about income level changes. But I just will note that self-reported data is subject to being affected by social desirability bias, but also recall error. So when the respondent just doesn't know, doesn't remember, or misremembers. So we should be explicit when we're using self-reported data and say that households reported increased incomes rather than households' incomes increased, just to be really clear about what data we actually collected. And there is also the Progress Out of Poverty Index, which is a good alternative for measuring poverty. For impact evaluations, getting measurements that are as accurate as possible is critical, and the JPAL guide talks about ways to develop non-survey instruments or creative ways of using surveys to get around social desirability bias and other potential risks. In case you're interested in a greater discussion, you can look at that resource. So moving on to the final step, once the data collection instruments have been decided upon, piloted, and verified that they work in your specific context, the key for developing a data collection plan is really to keep in mind that gender dynamics and power dynamics based on gender are a part of the data collection process as well. So the gender of who's collecting the data and how will likely affect the results. So for example, if you're using recorded messages via phone surveys, the gender of the voice may matter. Or if you're using SMS, you might want to verify if men and women have equal access to cell phones. The Gender Innovation Lab at the World Bank and some researchers at JPAL have also found that not only does the surveyor gender and class and other kind of demographic elements matter, but their own beliefs also matter when it comes to how they ask questions and how they respond. That affects how respondents will provide answers. And it's also important to think about how financial inclusion interventions can disrupt local power dynamics, and we should incorporate that into our data collection strategy as well. So in particular, are there increased risks of violence as a result of giving women more access to financial resources and control? So today we've provided a framework of things to consider when it comes to moving past access and usage of financial services and towards understanding, verifying, and achieving economic empowerment for women around the world. And so these are some of the key takeaways that we hope you'll bear in mind moving forward. And now I'll hand it over to Dina, who will introduce us to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Sophia and Claire, for this presentation on the toolkit. And I think this is a very valuable resource for all of us as we start thinking more and more about how to integrate more qualitative research on women's economic empowerment into our program design as well as our M&E frameworks. And I think we can't stress enough, and one of the the most important takeaways I think is that good measurement really depends on understanding the local gender dynamics and what women want in a particular context, and how that may in fact be very different from what we want for them. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Nellie to talk a bit more about right fitting of evaluations based on your needs and available resources, and how these principles and processes that you detailed in your presentation can be applied for a range of M&E use cases beyond impact evaluations. Nellie?
Hi, thank you for that introduction, Dina. I'm just trying to pull up the slides quickly.
Okay. Sorry, let me just see.
There we go. All right, well, thank you, Dina, for the introduction, and Lucia and Claire for that great presentation. Because the JPAL guide focuses on measuring women's empowerment for impact evaluations, we want to delve a bit deeper into what financial inclusion practitioners who are interested in answering some research questions related to their programming, but may not be able to do an impact evaluation should consider instead. So JPAL's presentation led into this nicely. What they talked about on identifying the research question, developing a theory of change, and creating a measurement plan are all important, whether you're doing a needs assessment to design a product or a program, simply monitoring your program activities, or actually conducting an impact evaluation. So when ITA uses the word impact, we are talking about how the world changed due to an intervention, and more precisely, how it changed compared to how it would have changed without the intervention. And in this context, that means looking at whether changes in women's economic empowerment are a result of financial products or services. Impact evaluations won't be the right fit for every organization or every learning strategy. And there's a few reasons why they might not be the right fit. So first, perhaps it doesn't answer the question that you're trying to ask. The program design or implementation might not be ready for that type of evaluation. If the program is scaled already, it could be a little bit more difficult to design an impact evaluation. The resources could be too limited to do that level of data collection. If the program setting is too chaotic, that could be a barrier. And it might not be worth it if we think that we already know the answer. And you could look more at some of those reasons and the explanations behind them in this SSIR article that I've screenshotted here. So what do we do instead? You'll want to consider how you can collect data and develop a learning agenda oriented around your inputs, outputs, and sometimes intermediate outcomes. Women's empowerment indicators tend to be a final outcome. So if you're not doing an impact evaluation, you probably won't be able to say that your program empowered women. But you will be able to collect other data to improve your program and inform your strategy, hopefully helping you get closer to that goal. Before I get into specific examples of other data collection activities and strategies that you might consider, I'd like to go over 4 key principles that we suggest organizations take into account when deciding what data to collect. Once I've explained these a bit, you'll probably all agree that these are not rocket science. And we agree, but we've been amazed to find how rarely these principles are effectively applied, and the wealth of insights that can be generated from putting the various data collection efforts of an organization to test across these relatively simple dimensions. The first principle is to collect high-quality data and analyze the data accurately. The principle of credibility involves 2 parts. First, credible data. That means that it is collected well. It is non-biased, and the indicators accurately measure what they're supposed to measure. For example, you design your measurement to avoid respondents just giving you the socially desirable response, as might happen when you're asking about norm-based behavior, for example. Credible data sounds obvious, but JPAL's presentation demonstrates the skills, energy, and attention that this often requires. The second part is that analysis produces an accurate result. For instance, even with high-quality data on the income of your beneficiaries, the causal impact of a program cannot accurately be measured without also accurately measuring what would have happened in the absence of the program. Or, in the case of formative research, which is so important to measuring women's empowerment, as JPAL has stated, you'll want to make sure that you have an expert in qualitative methods and analysis on your research team. So if the data itself or its analysis is not credible, you may actually be worse off than with no data at all, because you may take wrong decisions that you are convinced are the right ones. Second, and I know that Claire spoke on this a little bit, but I think it bears repeating, only collect data that can help you make choices and commit to acting on your findings. As has already been said, deciding how you are going to use the data you collect is the first step in developing a measurement strategy. Even the most credible data is useless if they end up sitting on a shelf, never used to help improve programs. Nonprofits and social businesses today have access to more data than ever before. Electronic data collection and efficient storage systems allow for more data collection at a lower cost. And in theory, more information could help you make better informed decisions. But in reality, the availability of more data often leaves organizations to become overwhelmed. So the actionability principle seeks to roll back this problem by only collecting data that will be used. Ask 2 questions of each and every piece of data that you want to collect. First, is there a specific action we will take based on the findings? And second, do we have the resources and the commitment required to take that action? The actionable principle can also help in deciding whether it is worthwhile to conduct an impact evaluation. The rule here is the same as for data collection. Only spend time and money conducting an impact evaluation if you are committed to using the results. Therefore, crafting an actionable evaluation means both designing it in such a way that it will generate evidence that can improve the program, but also making an honest commitment to use that evidence regardless of the results. Third, ensure that the benefits of data collection outweigh the cost. Collecting too much data has a real opportunity cost. The money and time spent collecting that data could be used elsewhere. On the other hand, too little data can hide flaws in program or product design when those programs and products are meant to have a social impact. So, we suggest that you ask yourself, is there a cheaper or more efficient method of data collection that does not compromise quality? Is the total amount of spending on data collection justified given the information it will provide when compared to the amount spent on other activities, such as administrative or programmatic costs? And does the information to be gained justify taking a beneficiary's time to answer the question? Finally, collect data that generates knowledge for other programs. To transport findings from one program setting to another, organizations need an underlying theory to help explain the findings. Such theories need not always be complex, but they should be sufficiently detailed to guide data collection and to help set boundaries and conditions under which the results are likely to hold and less likely to hold. When organizations are clear about their theory of change and their implementation strategy, it helps others who are doing similar work, either internally or at other organizations. So back to what to do instead. First, look at the available literature. In some cases, the answer about whether a program shifts women's empowerment on your outcomes of interest might already be known from another study or set of studies. Ask yourself, is the theory behind the evaluated program similar to my program? In other words, does the program rely on the same mechanism to create change? And is the context that matters for my program similar to the study setting of the other evaluation? If you can answer yes to those questions, another impact evaluation may not produce new information, but reviewing the literature can help you learn and inform your program. Second, and this is one that I talk about a lot, information on how clients or beneficiaries are managing their finances might help you better design and target your products and services. For example, if you see that many of your clients are saving, but few have a mechanism for planning on how to use or save or spend their money, you may decide to integrate a planning tool into your services. Though you're actually looking at outcome data here, this behavior data, it can be useful even without a counterfactual. But if you do decide to track this data over time, just be sure to resist the temptation to draw conclusions about the causal impact of your program on these outcomes. If the research questions that are most actionable for you aren't about impact, but about who in your population most needs these services or what their current financial behaviors are, focus on collecting data that will help you better design your evaluation and target your beneficiaries. Then track implementation. Get regular feedback and collect other management data that you can use instead. Good monitoring data are often collateral damage in the pursuit of measuring impact. Information on what the staff is doing, take-up and usage of program services, and what constituents think of operations can help create a better program and a stronger organization. But such data needs to be clearly connected to a decision-making system based on a theory for the program. A clear and detailed theory of change supports organizations in pinpointing the key outputs of each program activity so that they can develop credible measures for them. External accountability requirements often focus on revenues and expenses at the administrative and programmatic levels. To move beyond accountability to learning, organizations need to connect cost and revenue data directly to ongoing operations. This way, they can assess the relative costs and services across programs and program sites. And finally, collect feedback. Feedback data answer the question, what do people have to say about your program? And when engagement data reveals low participation, feedback data can provide information on why. Low engagement may signal that more feedback is needed from intended beneficiaries to improve the program delivery. So I am over time, but I just wanted to mention my presentation is based on Dean Carlin and Mary Kay Guggerty's new book, The Goldilocks Challenge. But this is specifically geared at, the book compiles case studies that illustrate a set of principles on how to design your learning agenda and measurement strategy. And it was developed alongside an advisory unit at IPA that provides hands-on support to organizations on their own journey to finding and using right-fit evidence.
Thanks, Nellie, very much for that. And I think that we all agree that the CART framework presented is relevant for all data collection, not just for impact assessments, and the importance of identifying really, what we want to measure and know as a critical first step before we start collecting additional data. And as well as the previous presentation noted the importance of all the existing data that's already out there and what we can already draw before developing more defined survey instruments and tools. So at this stage, we still have about 15 minutes, a little bit under for Q&A. I don't know if people are having difficulty or understand where to put the questions, but there are two different venues, and one is the chat function. I think that is where we had suggested, as well as the Q&A. But I'll start off with one question that we have. We heard a lot about the importance of building on qualitative research prior to the design phase of a project, and the importance of formative research, and to help inform not only evaluation but also monitoring functions. And I wanted to ask, what would you say to those who want to add on women's economic empowerment indicators to an existing project? We have a lot of discussions around that in the data and measurement working group. Aren't there a short list? Can we just add based on what you have all been talking about, what would your response be to that?
So I think formative research, this is Claire, I think formative research is something you can do at any phase of the project, and I really like the point that Nellie brought up during her presentation, that it's useful to bring on people who have experience or expertise in qualitative research in our M&E teams. But for instance, if you wanted to add on a couple WE indicators to an existing project, you could think about organizing semi-structured interviews or focus groups with clients to understand, what decisions are they hoping to make with these financial services and products, to identify how they might be helping them, and then use that to pick 2 or 3 survey questions that you could add on to your existing indicators. So it's definitely possible to do throughout the life cycle of a product, and it's just important to start it before you actually launch a product or launch a new M&E tool.
Great, thank you. Nellie, did you have something you wanted to add?
No, that's fine for me.
Okay. We also heard about different levels of outcomes that can be measured for women's financial inclusion, from access to financial services to behavioral change around financial health, depending on your theory of change and local context. Can you tell us if there are any subset of indicators that you see evolving from your work as good practice within the financial inclusion sector? I know that there was one slide that kind of looked at different outcome levels, but in terms of indicators themselves.
So I think, Nellie, would you like to share some about your work you're doing on financial health? I think that's quite relevant.
Yeah, I was going to jump in with that. So IPA is working on developing a financial health tool that we're currently in the process of testing in several different countries where we have country offices and other projects. And this tool looks at several different layers. It looks at access, behaviors, and outcomes. And we have identified within that behavior section several different indicators. I had mentioned sort of regularly saving and financial planning, so other similar indicators along those lines. And then at the outcome level, we're looking at people's ability to withstand economic shocks. What happens when they have an unexpected expense or a period in which they're not receiving income. So that will actually be available publicly next year. But if anyone has questions about it, I'm happy to answer those.
Great. And are you pilot testing that out currently?
Yes, it is currently being tested.
Great. And will you be sharing any of those results prior to the tool launching?
I think that we'll be publishing everything all at the same time.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm just looking again at the question. So let me move down to the next one. On both presentations stressed the importance of using existing resources for women's economic empowerment indicators wherever possible. And you reference global surveys looking at poverty, health, and empowerment indicators and empowerment outcomes. And given that these standard measures are being used globally at a country level, is it not sufficient just to use these indicators, or do we still need to develop locally tailored metrics? And if you could talk a little bit more about your experience using those data sets.
So I think it depends on what your goal is. If your goal is to learn something that could help you improve your products or services, I think it's important to ask whether these standardized modules actually generate data that could help you do that. On the other hand, standardized modules might be useful for something like just tracking how empowerment is changing over time in a particular context at a really high level. I think when we use kind of the same metrics across different places, they end up kind of defaulting to the basic common denominator and measuring more about preventing or reducing extreme disempowerment, and they tell us kind of less about the complex process of empowerment. But I think they're quite useful to draw on for survey question ideas where we can't all write new survey questions. And so I guess my main plug would be to pilot them with real people that you want to get information from, see whether they're easy to understand, and actually generate data that you can use before deciding to roll them out as your main tool.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Did either of the other presenters have anything to add?
This is Lucia. One thing that we have sort of discussed before is a way that some of these kind of standardized metrics can serve as what Claire references kind of like a baseline or the kind of minimum standards for certain concepts, and then and that is useful to compare across contexts, but then supplementing with more specifics on your setting can be a good way of bolstering them and ensuring that we're not only measuring the sort of minimum or baseline conditions.
And they also default a lot to objective measures of empowerment, and it can be nice to think through adding subjective measures about women's self-perceptions about their quality of life, their self-esteem, their happiness, whether they feel like they have freedom of choice. And these questions are nice to consider adding on because they take seriously the notion that empowerment is about women's own perceptions of their agency, as well as the ability to achieve things with that agency.
And in the psychology literature, some of those questions have also been standardized and validated across contexts. The World Bank's Gender Innovation Lab report on measuring women's agency goes through a lot of those more subjective indicators and talks through to what extent they've been validated. So that's a great resource to check out as well.
Great. And how do you see more of these subjective measures being added into more regular programming M&E frameworks, given that they are, a bit more resource intensive and require much more thought process, also in terms of, developing upfront your theory of change and all the things that we've talked about. Are you seeing more movement towards that?
So I think definitely in the research world, we're seeing more movement towards that. I don't know about in financial inclusion providers, MFIs, et cetera. What I think it would be a good place to start for organizations that want to experiment in this realm but haven't done it before are to start with the less challenging types of subjective measures, like one question modules about, how happy are you? How happy would you describe yourself? Do you feel like you have freedom of choice and control over your own actions? These have been widely tested and validated and summarized in that paper from the World Bank's Gender Innovation Lab that Lucia mentioned, so you can kind of read about the pros and cons of them there. And they're much less complicated than thinking about things like self-efficacy scales or relative autonomy indices, which are, longer first, but then also people have trouble understanding them in different contexts. So you have to do a lot of piloting, so it might be easier to start with a single question.
Right, great. I'm going to try and get in a couple more questions in the last few minutes. One of the attendees would like to know if there are any financial inclusion household survey data available that captures some of the indicators on women's economic empowerment.
So I saw that question and another from the same person about engaging the World Bank Findex team to include these indicators on their survey. Mm-hmm. There is some additional work going on at the World Bank, a Gender Innovation Lab, around identifying the indicators that we want to focus on for measuring women's economic empowerment. And I can't speak to how they're working with the Global Findex team. We are also engaging with the Global Findex team to sort of develop this financial health tool that I've spoken about. And that does include some questions around autonomy and control over financial decisions. But I think that this is something that can bear more thought and collaboration that we could speak on. I can't think of any other sort of nationally representative surveys that really look in depth at both financial inclusion and women's economic empowerment.
Right, and to tie it in maybe to this last question about are there learnings that we'd like to share on standardizing outcomes and how to coordinate researchers and programmers to adopt it, this is actually one of the topics on our work program for the Data and Measurement Working Group under the Community of Practice. And we will be having a meeting in New York on November 6th, where we'll be discussing this topic and trying to really kick off a work stream around that and, what this means, how do we think more in a more standardized way on incorporating women's economic empowerment indicators into financial inclusion measurement frameworks? What does that take? What would be the best entry points for that? And so for those of you who will be there in New York, we look forward to your participation. And IPA will be there as well as our other co-chairs on the Data Measurement Working Group. So maybe that will be a good way, it's 11 o'clock, to wrap up this webinar. I want to thank again all of our speakers for their presentations and for those of you who signed in today. And we'll, along with the PowerPoints and the webinar recordings, we'll send out links to the toolkits and the resources that were presented today. Thank you all very much. Oh, and please remember to complete the poll before logging off. We'll leave that open. We won't close the WebEx to give everyone time to go through and answer just those 5 quick questions. All right, thank you all, Claire, Lucia, Nellie.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'll see you all at the meeting.
Okay, great.